Senator Whitehouse, Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciated the willingness of Judge Jackson to come before our committee and answer questions. I've enjoyed getting to know her. She seems like a wonderful human being, one who's dedicated to her family. She comes with some impressive qualifications academically and professionally. She's someone who's clerked at all three levels of the federal judiciary and, if confirmed, will have served at all three levels of the federal judiciary. Itself a significant and valuable experience. It is important to understand what kind of Supreme Court justice she would be. And that's why this can't be something that simply focuses on the historic nature of the nomination. By the way, on that point, as to the historic nature of the nomination, earlier today there was a Politico tweet. Politico sent out a tweet reading as follows, saying, Ketanji Brown Jackson will likely be confirmed as the first black Supreme Court justice by the end of this week. Here's how we expect it to go. Now, if that were true, that would come as news to the family of Thurgood Marshall. And it would come as great news to Justice Clarence Thomas and his family. When we hear, as we've heard today, calls for making sure that we respect the need to show inclusiveness, let's remember how members of this committee have treated others. Let's remember how they treated Justice Clarence Thomas. Let's remember how they're still treating Justice Clarence Thomas, how people on the left are savagely attacking him. One of the most decent human beings that I've ever known, one of the most decent human beings and brilliant jurists ever to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States, or any court for that matter. Let's remember how members of this committee and people on the left treated Janice Rogers Brown and Miguel Estrada. So if you're going to make it about inclusiveness, let's remember to be inclusive in our discussion of inclusiveness. It's also important to talk about judicial philosophy. There's a reason we talk about it. We talk about it not just because it's jargon that makes us feel good or there's some sort of comfort food. We talk about it because we must talk about it, because that's how we make sure that our government functions as it should. When you have someone serving on any federal court, but especially the Supreme Court of the United States, if they don't have a proper understanding for the limited role of the federal judiciary, for the separation of powers between the three branches, the judicial branch can become very dangerous, in which the will of the people can be thwarted by justices who are not willing to recognize limits on their own power, limits on their own jurisdiction. Judges and justices who can't recognize what they're empowered to do, and that their role is not a policy-making one, but an interpretive one. That's why we ask so many questions about judicial philosophy. For a judge that wants to achieve a particular outcome, for a judge who looks at a case from the standpoint of figuring out what result he or she would be comfortable with, then that becomes the judicial philosophy. The achievement of a fair result, of a result that the judge or justice feels comfortable with, is the guiding principle. The judicial philosophy matters also because there are a lot of consequences to having a bad judicial philosophy. Now, when we asked about Judge Jackson's judicial philosophy, when we asked her, when we asked others, we were told frequently that we should look at her record. So we looked at her record. We've got a lot of things in her record that we found concerning, including a couple of cases in which she acted without jurisdiction. The Make the Road New York case is a troubling example of this, as is the AFGE versus Trump case. In both circumstances, she took an executive action taken within the Trump administration, action that she apparently disagreed with, and issued declaratory and injunctive relief to invalidate those actions. And in both cases, she was overturned by the left-leaning U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. These cases haven't gotten as much attention as some of her other rulings, as some of her sentencing decisions, but they're very, very significant. They're deeply troubling to me, because when someone's willing to act when they lack jurisdiction and or when they don't have a valid cause of action upon which to grant that relief, that's someone who's cutting at the heart of the limits on judicial authority and creating a dangerous set of circumstances. So we're told to look at her record, and yet much of what we see from her record is disturbing. We're told to look at her record, and yet we still don't have significant portions of her record on another disturbing line of rulings, those dealing with her sentencing imposed in child pornography cases. Now, she made the argument, and many on this committee have made the argument for her as well, that all judges sentence this far out of the guidelines, as far out of the guidelines as she did in those cases, as if she were somehow within the mainstream of judges on sentencing cases like these. But based on what we've seen, she sentences 47% below the national average. Then just 3 days ago, and over a week after the hearings were concluded, we received the sentencing transcripts from a case where Judge Jackson gave yet another light sentence to a violent child rapist who failed to give truthful information to the court, falsified his address for purposes of requiring a sex offender registry participation. In this instance, the defendant, Mr. Weeks, sexually assaulted another female family member shortly after being released. He then bribed the victim, apparently, into refusing to testify against him. Mr. Weeks would have been in prison and unable to sexually assault his sister-in-law if Jackson hadn't sentenced him below the guidelines range and below the government's recommendation. Now, Judge Jackson insists that her sentences are based on mitigating factors, those articulated in 18 U.S.C. Section 3553, and that we could understand that if only we had the record before us. Now, for whatever reason, the White House and the Democrats on this committee aren't all that concerned about making sure we have that record. And in fact, they seem determined to do the opposite of that. And Judge Jackson puzzlingly claims that she doesn't have access to those records, even though it appears that she, through her chambers, got key pieces of that information that could have been drawn from the pre-sentence reports, which we've requested, and sent sensitive information from those reports over to the White House. Well, something doesn't add up here. So when we ask about her judicial philosophy, we're told to look at her record, and yet when we look at her record, what's there is troubling to us, and very often there's a whole lot that simply isn't there. I'm also concerned about her inability or unwillingness to answer certain basic questions. Whether it's in response to whether it's in response to a question from Senator Blackburn, a simple question, what is a woman? To her refusal to respond to my question regarding her views on efforts to pack the Supreme Court of the United States. These are troublingly inadequate answers that she provides because she doesn't answer them at all to very basic questions, questions that she could easily answer, should easily answer, and the fact that she doesn't and won't and hasn't is concerning. Finally, I'm concerned by her response to Senator Kennedy, echoing former Justice Brennan's philosophy that 5 unelected Supreme Court justices can find new unenumerated constitutional rights. Quote, well, at any time the Supreme Court has 5 votes, then they have a majority for whatever opinion they determine, close quote. That's troubling. Look, the record doesn't support what they say it supports. Even more troublingly, the stuff that they say is supportive of her record, stuff we haven't been given. Why? Why? This is not a vacancy that currently exists on the Supreme Court. There's no reason to rush this. So why not give us access to the documents that we need, documents that she insists maintain and defend the sentences she issued in those cases, very often disregarding, in whole or in part, sentencing enhancements for child pornography offenders. Not just child pornography. Let's call this what it is. This is commercialized. These are commercialized efforts to profit off of child sex torture. Enhancements for computer transmission and receipt, for number of images, for prepubescent victims, and for sadomasochistic conduct carried out in those. Very often dismissing or minimizing those enhancements simply because she disagrees with certain key policy elements underlying them. This is troubling, and we don't even have the pre-sentence reports and the other documents we need to review them. I will vote no.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Klobuchar.